Welcome to Global Perspectives. How do the Kurds fit into the evolving political mosaic of the Middle East? For answers, we turn to Bayan Rahman, the Kurdish representative in Washington, D.C.
Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to the show, Bayan.
Thank you very much.
So before we get into your work as representative of the KRG in Washington, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got there? What were you doing previously, either in terms of the KRG or in terms of other professional activities?
Well, thank you. Perhaps I should give some background on my family and why I had an interest in politics and diplomacy, let's say, in the first place. My father was in the leadership of the Kurdish movement in Iraq, and he was a very prominent figure in Kurdistan from the 1960s onwards. And so I grew up in that kind of atmosphere. People who were coming through our home were people that later I might see on television speaking or leading a movement. So I think I just grew up in that atmosphere, and I was very aware of Kurdish rights being trampled on by various regimes, including Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party, and aware of my father's activities, first as a Peshmerga, a guerrilla fighter at the time, and then later more as a statesman and a diplomat. So I think with that background, maybe it was inevitable that I would eventually go into public service, but of course I didn't realize that as a child or as a teenager or so on. My family fled Saddam Hussein in the 70s. My parents were both sentenced to death by Saddam because of their activities for the liberation movement. And we lived in Iran very briefly, and then we moved to Britain. My father, to be honest, never really settled in Britain. He was always involved in the Kurdish movement back home, but my mother and her 4 children, we lived in a suburb of London, hence my British accent that everybody points out. And I went to university there, school, and so on, and I worked as a journalist to begin with.
What was your journalism work about? What organizations and what were your subject areas?
Well, I started in local newspapers in South London and then North London, so I was doing local news and reporting, editing, even photography at one time as part of my general work. And then eventually, actually I won a prize as a young journalist, which really helped boost my career. And I ended up working freelance for The Observer, which is sort of the Sunday newspaper of The Guardian. And full-time I worked for the Financial Times in London and also in Japan. And it was great. I loved being a journalist. I think it's a wonderful career, especially if you work for an ethical organization, as I did. I was very fortunate, and I was a Tokyo correspondent for the Financial Times, which was a great privilege. So to continue my story, I was a journalist in Tokyo when 9/11 happened, and we all knew this changed everything. And very soon it became clear that the United States was going to intervene in Iraq. And I was asking myself, do I want to continue as a journalist, which is a great profession that I enjoyed? In other words, do I want to observe what's happening in my country, or do I want to be part of it? And these were the conversations that I was having with my father by telephone mostly. I was in Tokyo, he was in Erbil in Kurdistan. And we kind of started to formulate a plan where I would leave journalism and head to Kurdistan and somehow engage in public service. We had some ideas floating around. And then unfortunately, my father, my brother, and many others were killed in a terrorist attack on February 1st, 2004. And that further propelled me to go into public service, to serve my people, because the Kurdish people have suffered so much throughout their history, particularly the recent history in Iraq. By that I mean since the creation of Iraq. And if there was anything that I could do, I was ready to do it. I was already thinking along those lines, but that event that affected me very directly and affected Kurdistan region in Iraq propelled me to take this much more seriously.
Was it difficult to move from journalism into politics and diplomacy? I know a lot of former people in government work and diplomacy who have gone into journalism typically as opinion columnists or something like that, but not so many who've gone the other way. Was it a difficult transition, or because of your family's political involvement, was it somewhat easier?
I think it was easier because of my entire family being completely involved and engaged in Kurdish politics and in the freedom movement. But there were some interesting things that I noted at the beginning. It was very strange for me to be interviewed when for the past 17 years I had been the one asking questions. And so that was a funny feeling, to be the ones that had to come up, the one that had to come up with the answer. And I also found it strange that sometimes journalists would ask me a question and I would give an answer where I would say, well, we're still formulating our response to this, or it's a fluid situation and we need to work things out. And you could see that the journalist was disappointed because they expected you to have hard and fast answers. And of course you don't. There are many times when you don't know what's happening, you have to wait, or you're waiting for somebody's response to something. But so there are a few observations that I would say that I made. But on the whole, perhaps I'm very fortunate that I had that family background, that personal interest anyway, and I did have a lot of help from friends who wanted me to get on and succeed.
Well, let's talk a bit about the Kurds as a population in the United States going back 20, 25 years. Most people knew nothing or relatively nothing about the Kurds. Today, they know a little bit more, but tell us about the Kurds. It's this large, stateless population with concentrations in 4 Middle Eastern countries, but large groups of them live in the UK, in the United States, and other parts of the world. Maybe something about the Kurds we don't know and should know.
Well, just speaking very generally, there are an estimated 40 million Kurds living in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. So where the borders of those 4 countries meet, speaking generally, this is where the Kurds are, this is our homeland. We are divided between these 4 countries, therefore we have to respect those borders. However, we also cross those borders very naturally. Many of us are linked by blood. My own family, I'm from Iraq because I was born there. My husband is an Iranian Kurd. My maternal grandmother was from Syria. And I have many relatives in Turkey, and this is not uncommon. So many of us cross the boundaries, both in terms of link by blood, land and belonging, if I can say that. But also I would say there are some beliefs that unite us. There are some ideological differences. There are some very left-wing and right-wing movements and so on. But I would say that there are some things that unite us. One is we are all struggling for protecting the rights of the people of Kurdistan, whether it's linguistic rights. In many places, speaking Kurdish would land you in jail. Naming your child a Kurdish name would land you in jail. So these are very basic things that people have been fighting for decades. But also the idea of an independent Kurdish state. Some people imagine those 4 parts of Kurdistan uniting as one unified Kurdish state. Personally, I think that's unrealistic today. Maybe in maybe 100 or more years' time, that's possible. I think it's more likely that you might see an independent Iraqi Kurdistan, or even something in one of the other parts of Greater Kurdistan. But to have one united Greater Kurdistan, I think, is unlikely in the near future.
The Kurds first came to the attention of many people in the United States, probably as a result of Iraq, although we were paying attention to what was happening in Turkey as well. but we never heard that much about the Kurds in Syria and Iran because of the nature of the regimes there. Now you've got active resistance in Syria and even some restiveness among the Kurds of Iran. But you were saying you didn't think that these four groups would form a single unit by themselves, at least not in the immediate future. More likely they would develop their own political paths for the time being. But
Yes.
Iraqi Kurdistan has seemed to be the leading candidate for statehood for quite a few years. I mean, I've been hearing this since I was much younger, and so I'm anticipating that may be an outcome in the near future.
I think it is on the cards. We are on the path to independence, for Iraqi Kurdistan at least. We believe it is our right, just as it's the right of any other nation, to have self-determination. So I believe we are on the path to that, but we want to achieve it through peace and dialogue and understanding. And that means, first and foremost, engaging with Baghdad on this issue. And this has been done in the past couple of months. There have been conversations with Prime Minister Abadi where this has been raised. But also it means talking to our neighbors, it means talking to our friends and allies further away, for example, the United States, Britain, France, many other countries. So it's not a hidden agenda. We have been very open about it. And as I said, key for us is to achieve independence in a peaceful way. Otherwise, what is the point? Our people have already suffered repeated episodes of genocide, the most current of which is the genocide committed by ISIS or Daesh against the Yazidi Kurds and the Christian minority and other minorities. How many more genocides do we need to face? Enough is enough at some point. But there are other reasons to want independence. The same reason that Americans enjoy independence, enjoy the rights that their constitution gives them. So I believe that we're on the path, but the question is when, not if, and we want to achieve it through dialogue.
I started looking into Kurdish issues in my early days as a journalist, which was a long, long time ago, and there weren't too many others who shared that interest. They just didn't see it as, an important or evolving issue. But I think many people have changed their opinion about this subject at the current time. But I remember many Kurds telling me the familiar line, we have no friends but the mountains. And today, do you feel that the Kurds have more friends? And where are their best friends? And are those enduring relationships, or are people still on the Kurdish side a little bit tentative and keeping the mountains as sort of a fallback position?
We have to keep the mountains as a fallback position. What happened under ISIS against the Yazidis in Sinjar in 2014 is the latest lesson that we've had in this. ISIS had just captured the latest American equipment from the Iraqi army in Mosul, so very sophisticated heavy weapons, even helicopters, and used the heavy weapons and their terror tactics to attack the Yazidis in Sinjar. And the only place they could flee to was Mount Sinjar until the airstrikes began and aid and assistance was able to come to them. So the mountains will always be our friends. But we do want to expand our circle of friends, and we hope that we have. I believe that the Peshmerga in the past 2 years have proven themselves to be brave, to have the spirit and the will to fight. Even when they have had inadequate equipment and training, they have nevertheless been ready to face ISIS. And I believe the Peshmerga have proven themselves to be a reliable partner to the United States and to the coalition who are working with us. So I hope that these things have built confidence among the coalition partners and particularly the United States. But there are many other areas that we want to focus on, not just the military relationship. We want to build interest in commerce, in cultural exchanges, university exchanges, and also diplomatically, much more broadly.
And I'm thinking, we hear a lot about the oil, especially in the Kirkuk area, but there are so many other aspects to the economic side of the equation, agricultural possibilities, tourism possibilities. And I know that there has been some development in both of those areas in recent years, but do you see them as becoming big elements of the Kurdish economy relative to oil, or do you think oil is always going to be sort of the dominant feature?
Oil is definitely the dominant feature of our economy today, but we've learned a very hard lesson that we need to diversify. We were aware of this, of course, before, but with the invasion by ISIS and the war, the very expensive war that we are fighting, and the brunt of the cost of the war is on us. At the same time, we have a humanitarian crisis with nearly 2 million people displaced by ISIS and, as a result of the Syrian conflict, taking refuge in Kurdistan region in Iraq. While we have those hits to our economy, we're also seeing a massive drop in the oil price compared with, say 2014. The oil price is very low. So we have learned the lesson that we need to diversify our economy, which we wanted to do, but now we need to do it much more rapidly and more seriously. And we have started to take steps towards reforming our economy. We have an agreement with the World Bank to reform the economy in Kurdistan to help us encourage the private sector to be much more active, but also to diversify into some of those areas that you mentioned. Historically, Kurdistan was the breadbasket of Iraq, so agriculture is a very strong area that we could revive. Also tourism. Tourism has always been a strong area in the Kurdish economy. We really were beginning to be a tourism destination within the Middle East, and even beginning to get tour groups from the United States and Europe when, of course, ISIS came, and it hasn't stopped, surprisingly. But of course the number of tourists has diminished. But also industry. We believe that Kurdistan could be an industrial base for many different sectors of the industry in Iraq and in the Middle East.
I suspect at least one reason the tourism hasn't stopped is that most people have faith in the ability of the Peshmerga to guard the homeland. And it's not like your typical military where they're fulfilling a requirement or something like that. These are people who are actually fighting for the place where they live. And
Yes.
and the courage, I think, of the Peshmerga speaks for itself, because they often go into battle with less sophisticated weapons and fewer capabilities across the board, and yet the courage and the persistence seems to help them prevail, as we've been seeing increasingly against ISIS, that it's being pushed back into Syria.
Yes, I agree. I think the Peshmerga have made all of us very proud and feel very humble with their courage. The Peshmerga have been fighting with inadequate equipment, sometimes even inadequate clothing, frankly. And I'm also very proud of the Kurdish population's response to the humanitarian crisis. While Europe has been holding its arms up in despair because of the migration crisis in Europe, we have been opening our arms to nearly 2 million displaced people. Our own population is only 5 million. So that's a huge increase in population. And we have to provide electricity, water, healthcare services. And the host community has been impacted enormously. The economy has been impacted enormously. But everyone is determined to see all of us through this. And that makes me very, very proud and very humbled. And it makes me even more determined to try to do more to serve our people. With regards to the Peshmerga, I think I really ought to say how grateful we are to the United States. Without the United States airstrikes against ISIS, without the training and the equipment, we would not be able to continue to fight ISIS. So we're very grateful for that. But it certainly has been an issue of contention between us and Baghdad and even Washington, D.C., where we aren't satisfied with the type of weapons and equipment that the Peshmerga have received. We are fighting the same enemy as the Iraqi troops. We're all fighting the same people. Why is it that an Iraqi soldier can have X and the Kurdish Peshmerga can only have Y, when we're all fighting the same enemy? So these are issues that we're in dialogue with Congress, with the old administration, the new administration, hopefully as well. But at the same time, bottom line, we're very grateful to the United States, to the government, to the Congress, and to the people of the United States who have been very moving in their response to the Peshmerga. Our office in Washington, D.C. has received letters from people just expressing their gratitude and their admiration for the Peshmerga, and that's very, very powerful and very moving.
We hear a lot of stories about the women of the Peshmerga. Why are they so remarkable? What is it they do that distinguishes them from women fighting forces in other countries in history?
Well, we've always had women in the Peshmerga. I remember when I was a kid in Kurdistan, we used to carry the photo of a female Peshmerga called Margaret. She always used to find a studio to go and pose in with her Kalashnikov or whatever she was carrying at the time. So there have been female fighters with the Peshmerga forces historically. But after 1992, when in Iraqi Kurdistan we had our first ever elections, and then we created the Kurdistan Parliament, the Kurdistan Regional Government, and law number 5 of the Kurdistan Parliament established the Peshmerga as the legitimate army of the Kurdistan region. We also started to have female police officers, women in the intelligence service, and also women in the Peshmerga. Our female Peshmerga forces are in combat, so they're in the front lines, they're in every possible position that you might have in your military, and we're very, very proud of them. And we also have some Yazidi units. Some of those women who escaped ISIS, maybe they were enslaved by ISIS or they escaped them in Sinjar. They have their own female Yazidi unit within the Peshmerga, and they're fighting ISIS today. So we're very proud of the role of the women within the Peshmerga.
I always think of the Yazidi as being a very peaceful population, and to have them inspired to the point where they're willing to take up arms against an adversary is a pretty remarkable development.
It is. I'm originally from Sinjar, but I'm not Yazidi. But being from Sinjar, I have so many friends and relatives who are from there, and many of them are Yazidi. And with the Yazidi friends, they feel that they've always been a persecuted minority because they're not Muslim. And what happened, or what is happening to them now under ISIS, there are still maybe a couple of thousand, maybe more Yazidi women, children who are enslaved by ISIS. What is happening to them is actually unbelievable. It's hard to believe that it's happening in the 21st century, and we want to support them in everything that they want to do. Return to Sinjar. They want ISIS to be held to account at the International Criminal Court, and they want to fight ISIS, and we want to support them in all of these fields, and it is their right. It is their right to want to do that.
As we come to the close of our conversation, is there one issue that you could just point to that would be the priority, or should be the priority going forward, between the United States and Kurdistan?
I think Kurdistan has proven itself to be a reliable partner militarily through the Peshmerga. We have also opened our doors to people of different sects, faiths, nationalities who are fleeing ISIS or the Syrian civil war. Kurdistan has become a beacon for religious freedom and tolerance. Almost every Christian in Iraq is now sheltered in Kurdistan, the same with the Yazidis. These are shared values that we have with the United States. And I would ask the people of America and the government and the Congress of America to look at Kurdistan as a beacon of stability, a bulwark against Islamic extremism, and to see us as a long-term partner, a reliable partner.
Good. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you, Bayan Rahman, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia, and we'll see you next time.